Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are joining us from. For those of you who have attended previous N4 webinars, you may have noticed that the introductory music sounded a little bit different today. And those clips were provided by one of our speakers, Susan McDonald, who will be joining us today. And all the artists that you saw in those videos are Syrian and are currently safe in Canada. And I'm actually just going to invite Susan to say a few words about those videos. And you're just unmuted now, Susan.
Okay. Both of those recordings were made in Lebanon in 2017. And so the artists were currently living in Syria, actually, except for Arantes, who had fled to Lebanon. But that was the story behind that. They were still living in very dangerous situations when those were recorded. So with the piece that you heard, the singer, this is by Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a 15th century humanitarian. And the text behind that is, how many orphans must there be? How many tears, how many broken hearts before humanity realizes basically that we need to love each other? So it seemed particularly appropriate for these artists who were caught in such difficult times to perform that.
Great, thank you so much for sharing those pieces, Susan. They were really beautiful. And before we get into our webinar today that will explore music, trauma, and healing, we would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So N4 is hosted at CHIO, which is located in Ottawa, Ontario. Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. And we also honor all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past and present contributions to this land. My name is Mariah. I use the pronouns she and her, and I am a project coordinator on the N4 team. I will be hosting and moderating the question and answer box today. And Andrew is our co-host today, and he will be monitoring the Q&A box as well. And Andrew has also put the links to those videos that we showed at the start in the chat if you'd like to watch the full length of each one of them. And so today's webinar brings together two knowledgeable subject matter experts who will describe the role that art, specifically how the power of music, has on healing, resiliency, and well-being for those who have experienced trauma due to war and oppression of their basic human rights. So our first speaker today is Nancy Clark. And Dr. Nancy Clark is an assistant professor at the University of Victoria. And Nancy is a community engaged scholar who works with non-government organizations and settlement agencies across British Columbia to support the mental health and well-being of immigrant, refugee, ethnocultural, and racialized groups in Canada. Her research is informed by social justice, intersectionality, and equity-oriented health and social policy. Dr. Clark's practice areas focus on community mental health and integration of social determinants of health of structurally vulnerable groups, including migrant groups affected by displacement. Dr. Clark is an alumna of the Liu Institute for Global Issues at the University of British Columbia and Intersections in Mental Health and Addiction Research Training. Dr. Clark is a research affiliate with the UBC Center for Migration Studies. And at the University of Victoria, Dr. Clark is also the co-chair of the Victoria Immigrant Mental Health Migrant Network, which links academic and community-based resources to support settlement agencies and trauma counseling for immigrants and refugees. So welcome, Nancy, and I'll just invite you to turn your video on. And our next speaker is Susan McDonald. And Susan is a world-renowned artist, musician, and storyteller. Susan is the Director of International Programs, Remember the River. And Susan McDonald has delighted audiences of the world over, from the Amazon to Iraq to community concerts to Carnegie Hall. Her audiences have ranged from Holocaust survivors in Vienna to the President of the United States, and her music has been enthusiastically received in concert halls, universities, festivals, schools, and hospitals. Increasingly, Susan's passion and energy is being directed towards bringing music to people in regions of conflict or isolation. Through her nonprofit organization, Remember the River, she works to support artists in conflict zones through teaching, mentorship, and donations of musical instruments and supplies. Susan works domestically with young audiences of Houston and serves as artistic director for Fine Arts Foundation, which also is known as Remember the River. She is director of guitar for Yes Academies in Iraq and Lebanon. So welcome, Susan, welcome, Nancy. We are really thrilled to have you here speaking today. And just a reminder to our audience, today's event is being recorded, and an on-demand version of today's event that does include a transcript will be available on our N4 platform, and we will share that link when it's available. And as well, today we invite your questions in the question and answer box. We have allotted time at the end of this presentation for your question and answers, and you also have the option today of upvoting questions you're interested in hearing the answer to. So please do check out the question and answer box and feel free to put your questions in there. And our speakers today have no conflicts of interest to declare. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Susan and Nancy.
Thank you so much for having us. It is really such a pleasure and an honor to be here. Nancy.
Sorry about that, everyone. I'm just had to figure out my volume. Thank you very much for the invitation from the N4 team. I want to acknowledge Mariah and Andrew as well for allowing us to engage with you in our conversation today. Looking and discussing the title of the talk, The Guitar in the Ceiling, with Susan and myself, and exploring really the role that music has related to trauma. So before I begin today as well, I would like to acknowledge where I'm located and situated. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm a visitor to South Vancouver Island, BC, which is the traditional territory and ancestral lands of the Algonquin peoples, on whose territory the University of Victoria stands. Also, I'd like to acknowledge the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanich people, whose historical relationship continues with us to this day. So I come to this work not as an expert, as I was described, but really as a learner and community engaged researcher interested in the rights and well-being of people that have experienced forced displacement. So recently I've been learning from experts in the field, which will be discussed today, on arts-based methods in research and methodological approaches, which aim to decolonize and mitigate injustices done with people that have experienced forced migration in Canada. And so we had some objectives, which might be a little bit ambitious for this presentation, but we wanted to really gain a better understanding about the role of music and healing, and to reflect on our own journey with our newcomer communities, to describe how music and music making can provide a medium for transcending language and building cultures of connection. And so the purpose will be to understand how music is a modality for belonging and empowerment, but also to sort of ground us in thinking about how music is also used in research with people with lived experience, the relationship that music has with trauma and violence, and also that music is actually a tool for social, political reasons and cultural processes. So together we hope to gain some insights today that help us to consider how music can also be incorporated or integrated, or even as an intervention to promoting well-being. And as I said earlier, to mitigate harmful effects of trauma for newcomer groups in Canada. And so I'd like to start with drawing attention to a world-renowned scholar who some of you may have recently heard at the University of Victoria, Dr. Carolyn Lynette. And she has a book on arts-based methods in refugee research. But I'm going to point out and discuss why this is very important. So in her text, she talks about how music and singing has significant implications for health research, including working with people who have cognitive impairment. And so recently there's been growing attention to using music as part of an umbrella or overall arts-based methods in research. But there is a paucity or not enough knowledge about this area. And that might be related to what Dr. Lynette talks about, that when newcomers are received, we're often more interested in addressing food security, shelter, and need for protection. And despite this, I love this quote that she uses to demonstrate the role of music and what it means for people that have experienced forced migration. And she says, "A phone call offering free access for the asylum seeker to our psychologists, social workers, and community development practitioners resulted in thanks, but no thanks response. We have our own counselors, thank you." And so afterwards, this excerpt says that another phone call from the same team happened, indicating that we're a small group of musicians who are interested in coming in a voluntary capacity, playing our guitars and our mandolins. And so this excerpt for me demonstrates the need for some asylum seekers to play music in order to build connection and tell their story through creative expression. In research, we're often concerned with ethical processes of engagement and doing more good than harm. So it's becoming increasingly evident that research with social justice aims, whether they're using qualitative or quantitative methods, can use music to address issues of connection, also recruitment, and a medium to inform policies and practices through creative expression, particularly where other methods such as theater or photo voice are less suitable. So today we're going to hear from Susan's experiences and several stories and examples where music traditions are associated with cultural identity, belonging, and which foster cross-cultural dialogue through music. So while music can be a tool in research with people with forced migration and those who live in violent contexts, it's also a social political tool for the performing arts and resistance through transnational spaces. Therefore, when using this approach in research, it must also be trauma informed as well. So I'd just like to pause and share with you a recent interview that you might have seen on the national which depicts music as communicating resistance.
There they were a few years ago, invited to perform at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. A heady moment and a dream realized for Zora, Afghanistan's first all-women's orchestra. From those so thrilled to be there then, a message for you now. Listen to them. Remember these smiles and sounds, because this is the Afghanistan they want you to know. Not this one. When the Taliban took over this summer, the cacophony of violence and chaos silenced all the sweet notes, especially here. The famed music school, built in 2010 as a place of promise for those emerging from life under the Taliban's grip. For young women in particular, it was a refuge. Now the girls are gone. Taliban fighters infest those colorful halls. It's become a militia base, armed men lurking in treasured spaces where music education once meant wings.
Today, the performance of this young musician clearly demonstrated how easily music can be understood by every single man and woman of this planet.
Building, then nurturing the school was Dr. Ahmed Sarmas's purpose in life.
This orchestra for me always was as a symbol of freedom, symbol of emancipation of women.
He is now, though, stuck, looking on from afar, in Australia when we spoke. Got there in the summer for medical treatment, unable to go back since he spends days and nights checking on his students.
We've been in the process of getting our students to a safety and security. I advise them to delete all the messages, deactivate their Facebooks, do not connect with their friends outside Afghanistan.
Some have gone into hiding. Others, like conductor Zarifa Adiba, had left a few years earlier to go to university abroad. Her friends, family back in Afghanistan, while she sits in Kyrgyzstan. And it haunts. Their text messages are hard to take.
I don't have quite good words to describe how these days and nights are passing.
I suppose there's a difference between existing and living.
Exactly, like everything is just like a movie, like a horror movie that is going on, you know? So I see my friends, they are breaking their instruments. They're breaking it before Taliban get to them, you know? So for them, I don't think that music is at the moment their comfort, but it's more of a risk for them.
Music once filled the mountains and valleys and streets and souls of Afghans. Decades ago, when the Taliban took control, they banned it. And now that they're back in charge, public performances are once more outlawed. The Afghan folk singer Fawad Andarbi was pulled from his home and killed by the Taliban not long ago. Imagine the chill that sends to the young women of Zora, alternately afraid of and cherishing the power of music.
Music has always been my friend, has always been my comfort, even especially in times like this that I feel hopeless, I feel tired, I feel scared.
As conductor, Zarifa was a leader, working with, learning with the likes of pianist Maram Ati. She moved to the music school as a teen, worked with Dr. Sarmas for years, touring with Zora. Then a few days before Kabul fell, she left for university in Michigan to study piano. Her heart clearly still at home and with friends now asking for help and advice.
I just told them that don't tell anyone, don't play if someone of the neighbor could hear a piano playing or something, just don't touch it.
And be careful. She sadly urges those back in Afghanistan not to fight too hard to save the music.
Fighting now is not a good idea. If someone just stood up and fight for music, you cannot do that right now. But I think all of this 20 years of hard work, it cannot go to waste like that. So maybe in the future, I believe that someone or people will just start from the beginning again.
That is for the future. This moment is for surviving. Dr. Sarmast has been helping his students as best as he possibly can. A few, like Mara, managed to leave a few days before the Taliban takeover. Getting others out now is exhausting and stressful. And for the women, dreams waver between trying to hold the memory of the togetherness they once had, the bold performances of traditional songs, and hoping to somewhere, someday, let the music's power speak again.
Every note talks to me and tells me that Zarifa, don't give up. Zarifa, play more, play louder. At the same time that my violin is peaceful, comforting, and beautiful, at the same time, it is so powerful and so strong and so rebellious, you know?
Zarifa's new life includes this new violin.
Beautiful.
Bought with help from supporters. She was just starting to get acquainted with it.
This is going to be my weapon, you know? Taliban are having their weapon, but this is my weapon. I will talk to you guys with this.
The Taliban scattered and silenced the orchestra, but the spirit of Zora lives, and the women promise they will be heard again.
So that was a very enlightening news episode, which many of you may have seen, but I show it because in the clip, it really describes music, not only as a healing modality, but actually as a weapon and as a point of resistance, where young women resisted their oppression and their right to create and express their music. For others, that experience of living in violent contexts, music can act as resistance, but also as a healing modality in trauma. And I draw on the work of the text by Sutton on music and music therapy that really puts together research around the globe around the effects of music and trauma. So a couple of points here is that not all people that have experienced violence or forced migration experience trauma, or even go on to experience what we call post-traumatic stress disorders, PTSD, or traumatic stress conditions. And as you might be aware already, that these experiences are described as an inability to recover from a reaction of stress, where people re-experience events, traumatic memories, prolonged emotional distress, and avoidance of trauma-related thoughts and external reminders. For people who live with trauma conditions, music as therapy can be, as I said, a therapeutic modality to express emotions and promote healing. Music therapy may also offer more accessible and less stigmatizing therapeutic options for treating conditions like PTSD and trauma-related conditions. So the other point that I'd like to mention is that we usually associate trauma with a single act of violence or event. However, as we know, the concept of trauma is changing. And has changed over the years to describe not only a single event, but ongoing experiences, as well as past events which can surface over time. So when people are resettling, in the Canadian context, for example, you may not witness or experience certain symptoms. They may actually happen quite later. So prior evidence of violence and trauma can be compounded by stressors associated with resettlement in Canada. And I'm sure you're all aware of some of the challenges that people have around accessing employment and safe housing and security. So these things can actually exacerbate underlying vulnerabilities, if you will, for trauma. When we look at work internationally, for example, Jay Marlowe's work with Sudanese men in Australia, he argued that trauma shouldn't be the master narrative for those who have experienced forced migration. So while stories of trauma, hardship, and despair reveal oppression and marginalized circumstances of people's lives, professional associations and associated support agencies also need to recognize the factors that support capabilities and agency of people with trauma. So music has the potential to shift that narrative by drawing attention to the story of a person's experience of trauma associated with forced migration and how that might negatively influence their life. And I'll share an example with you. So again, just to highlight that another sort of nuance here is that while most people are said to be traumatized, have experienced or witnessed a violent event, others don't have to be present at that time to experience trauma themselves. So for example, the vulnerability to trauma is impacted by things like media reports, communication, and pictures that convey violence. In my work with Syrian refugee women in Canada, they described how the violence that occurred in London, Ontario on June 11th, 2021 was fueled by anti-Muslim hate, where 4 victims spanning 3 generations were targeted and killed by a non-Muslim man in his 20s who ran into them. So in working with Syrian mothers in BC, they spoke to me about the impact that that event had on their ability to attend their local mosque during Ramadan in the context of COVID-19 as well, where social gatherings are, starting to be, well, they're very important for people, but where that's been prohibited in the context of our pandemic. So the women perceived that they'd be treated differently because they were visibly different because they wear a hijab. In addition to witnessing violence, Syrian women also spoke about their families that were left behind. Although they were grateful to come to Canada for the opportunities that it afforded for their children and some security, they continue to experience stress and worry of the violence of family that's left in the crossfire of the civil war in Syria. So our research didn't look into the role of music and its cultural association. However, when Syrian women were speaking to us, they disclosed their experience of stress, as I mentioned, being vulnerable, walking out to a mosque. So they decided to hold all their gatherings during Ramadan indoors. And the key thing that they mentioned and said was that listening to traditional music from home in an intergenerational context allowed them to build a sense of connection where children and elders were present. So I really felt how important that was as sharing that music, and traditional music from home was for sense of culture and belonging. So some evidence suggests that people who experience trauma also experience a loss and a security of their own safety and powerlessness, which may leave one unable to feel that the world is quite the same, that it's not the same place before the traumatic event. So again, listening to traditional music could provide a sense of empowerment and resistance. In this sense, one can view music as a protective mechanism for healing. So I mentioned earlier that I would talk a little bit about how music works as a healing modality. And again, I'm not the leading expert on this topic, but what I can see is, or to explain it, is that when we look at emotional responses to music, we see neurologically mediated changes. In other words, it activates brain centers, if we're trying to describe this from a medical perspective. And music activates the reward, pleasure, and emotional processing of our brain. Some of this work has been substantiated, as I alluded to earlier, with population groups with cognitive impairments such as dementia, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, or even terminal conditions such as cancer. So in other words, music has the potential to improve clinical and functional outcomes, as well as fostering resilience with people struggling with post-traumatic stress. Overall, research shows that there's a large amount of research shows that there's evidence to reduce emotional distress and improve overall well-being, and that music is used as a communication aid to transcend language, particularly when we're working with groups that we don't have translators for, or where there are language challenges, including for those that are that have deafness. So for people living in violent context, communal music making also promotes resilience and healing. There's been work done with youth in post-apartheid South Africa, suggesting that working with youth that self-report that music reduces their anxiety, stress, and fear in violent contexts. Similarly, studies done in Northern Ireland also point to political and social cultural factors that support cohesion and cooperation. So overall, music can cultivate resilience and healing, and where people can have a greater sense of identity and belonging. More recently, trauma researchers have been promoting the use of alternative and less invasive and stigmatizing treatment modalities for trauma survivors, as I mentioned, through the creative arts, music being one of them. And one of the theories around this is that for trauma survivors, using music involves the body and movement. And this suggests that the body as emotion has a special role in trauma work, which helps people feel grounded so that they can process and assimilate the emotional impact and experiences of trauma. And as I mentioned, finally, that within social groups, music also fosters cohesion and cooperation. So how did I get to this? I came to know about the role that music has on identity and belonging and cohesion through the dramatic story of the Syrian guitar quartet, which you heard earlier. And the quartet members all experienced the ongoing unrest in the Syrian civil war. And this was guided by Dr. Alexander Dunn, who's an internationally renowned guitarist and instructor at the University of Victoria School of Music, and Susan McDonald's work in her innovation at the Institute of International Education and non-for-profit organization Remember the River. And they were able to secure the quartet's arrival in Canada, and Susan can speak more about that. But what I was fascinated about when I learned about them, there was an article in the Globe and Mail where they interviewed the musicians. And the ensemble, when they played together, they said, "We forget everything because we just focus on what we're doing." And here's a great picture of Dr. Dunn and the quartet. And through the Syrian quartet, I was introduced to Susan McDonald. And in addition to her prestigious career as a classical guitarist, as you may have read and heard today, she's worked around the globe teaching classical music to refugees and also people that are living in violent contexts. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Susan now and invite her to share her experience with us by asking her some questions, some prompts, but I think her storytelling will take us much deeper. So I'll open it up and just ask Susan, tell us a little bit about how you came to teach classical music in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and other parts of the world, and how that informs your music making.
Oh my goodness. Thank you, Nancy. It's been very life-changing. I was invited in 2013 to go and start a guitar program in Iraqi Kurdistan under the auspices of American Voices, Yes Academies. And these academies work with talented musicians, usually ages 15 to about 25, in areas we thought at the time emerging from conflict. And in many of these cases, there's a brain drain because the professors have been killed or fled the country. And so we would go in during the summers and give maybe a 2-week-long workshop. And the students would get the chance to work on technique and performing, and ultimately, as time went on, relaxation techniques, because back in 2013, we thought the violence in Iraq was done for now. The US forces had pulled out, things were calming down. It was beautiful, life-changing. The people had been through so much, and finally we're having a chance to recover. Well, in 2014, we had to cancel because ISIS was sweeping through the region, Daesh. And so we moved our base of operations to Lebanon the following year. And through the time that I spent there, several guitarists managed to come over the border from Syria to attend my class. And as I got to know them, and as they spoke about other artists they knew in Syria, I realized just the exquisite talent that was living under such incredibly violent conditions that I became determined to do something to help them escape these conditions. And so that's how I got to know the members of the Orontes Quartet. They weren't actually a quartet yet back in 2015, but we worked together to form that. And they were especially such an inspiration to me because they were so talented, so dedicated. Well, to give you an example, a colorful story actually, they'd been invited back in Syria to perform a concerto with the Syrian National Philharmonic at the Damascus Opera House, which is like playing at Carnegie Hall, one of these places, the big hall in Carnegie Hall. So this was a big deal for such young musicians. And I was in close touch with them during all of this via WhatsApp. So they're preparing and working on getting psyched up for this moment. And all of a sudden, explosions wrecked the building. And mortars had been fired into the crowd of 1,500 waiting to come into their concert. And their immediate impulse was to rush out into the crowd to help in any way that they can. And finally, when the dead had been removed and the wounded attended to, they caught eyes of the conductor and they nodded at each other and went back into the hall. The crowd followed them, those who were still living and uninjured followed them, and they performed the concerto beautifully by memory. And they understood, and the audience understood that at that moment, that was life, that was healing, that was how they were going to survive this thing that happened. And so I think that's such an example of the power of music, both as a player and as an audience member during times of trauma. As well, personally, back in 2016, I was playing in a refugee camp in the Bekaa Valley. So this is the eastern part of Lebanon. And if you go to the US or Canadian diplomatic sites, this is the area marked with red exclamation points. Don't go to this area, especially not then, because there is a high risk of danger. And back then, I didn't realize really how close we were going to be to the border, but there were frequent ISIS incursions. And really, the only thing keeping ISIS away from that section often was Hezbollah. So here I am, an American coming to play in this refugee school. And what do I know? I haven't gone through this kind of trauma, but I was very honored to have the chance to come and be with these people, these little kids who had fled. They were all Syrian and had witnessed just ungodly violence. And in many cases, their parents had been killed in front of them, their siblings. So these were deeply, 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 deeply traumatized little kids. And I went into the school and there were 150 of them and just complete cacophony. And they're all screaming, hitting each other and just primal screams. They were so traumatized. And I thought, my little guitar, no amplification, there was no electricity. And so you're not even going to hear it or care. And it's a quiet instrument. And yet the moment that I sat down to play, the moment the first note came out of my instrument, there was utter silence. it was almost eerie. They were so quiet, and they listened to every note, and it was a quiet piece. And I finished, and then some little sound set them off again. And again, they just started screaming, shrieking, and running around, and just hysterical, really, almost. So again, I played, and again, they were completely silent. And so I was feeling really good about, this power of music coming through me. And then gunfire went off right outside of where we were. And I, in that moment, understood the sheer terror of being in this situation, because I knew that if this were ISIS, I would be a prime target. I mean, I knew what they would do to me if they caught me. And so I was so terrified. And the kids, they knew what that meant too, and they were terrified too. And I thought, the only thing that I can do in this case, it's going to do no good to try to run away. That's not going to help. And I started playing again, and I felt this power of music moving through me. And the kids, huddled, and they were calm then. And we never found out what the gunfire was, but what I really did come to understand is how deeply, deeply powerful music is as protection, as psychological, emotional protection. So that I can attest to that firsthand, that it absolutely is.
Thanks.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Susan. It really highlights some of the things that we were presenting, but also the issue that you were there experiencing it with them. But having the privilege, like you were able to leave, but how that still sits with you today, and even just hearing it can conjure up and trigger some of us that are listening, and I think it's a very powerful story. I have a couple of other things I'd like to ask you by way of sharing with our audience. Can you explain the story behind the guitar in the ceiling?
Oh goodness, yes. Okay, so the last time that I was in Iraq was in 2017, and we'd flown over from Beirut, and it was one of the first flights allowed to fly back over Syria. So things were still kind of ramped up in Syria. But okay, we flew over the Syrian desert and looked down below. And it just so happened that we flew in 3 days after the liberation of Mosul from ISIS. And Mosul is maybe an hour away from Erbil, where we were. And so you still saw the smoke off in the distance. And things were very intense. This is all very fresh. And so several students, several musicians were able finally to make it over the border into Kurdistan through the security forces. So these artists had been living in Mosul under the reign of ISIS. And during this reign of Daesh, which I prefer to call them, playing music was punishable by public execution. And so to play music, you were risking your life. You knew if you were caught, you would be killed or worse. So these musicians, though, were so eager to play music and share music and learn and express themselves. And so they got to the border, and they're dressed in their suits. And that part of the world, at that time of year in August, it was probably 120 degrees, just utterly sweltering. And so these guys are here with their instruments and in their suits, and the security forces were not going to let them in because they're from Mosul, maybe they're Daesh, they don't know. And so finally, after 9 hours waiting, they thought, what the heck? And they pulled out their instruments and they started playing. And the border guards were so excited because obviously if they were Daesh, they wouldn't be playing music, especially not at that level. And so one of the border guards called his brother in Erbil, who had a taxi, and he came and brought him. And so now we're all together, and it was just magical. And one of my students told me, he said, we would have had a lot more guitarists. They really, really wanted to come, but all the instruments were destroyed. Daesh would find instruments and destroy them. And so there were very, very few instruments in Mosul, and those that were hidden. So the story of the guitar in the ceiling is that my student had his guitar, and he had managed to open a space in his ceiling tiles, and he hid his guitar up there and covered it up. And late at night, he would look out the door very, very carefully, very much in the middle of the night, and would make sure no one was around and listen for a while, these dark, dark streets. And finally, he would open the ceiling and take his guitar out and very, very, very quietly play for himself. And he believed it gave him power. It was the thing that gave him hope. And it was his quiet form of resistance. And so that as a title to this discussion, I think is very profound, because all of us carry something within us that gets us through difficult times. And ideally, all of us during difficult times are able to channel that, whatever it is, if it's music, if it's art, if it's cooking, if it's love, if it's memories, all of these things. For him, it was the guitar. And so this is another reason why I think for displaced people, music is so important, because it recalls that strong private part of themselves. If they've left their beloved home unintentionally, and because things just got so bad, that doesn't mean they don't still love their home. It doesn't mean they don't still love their culture. And so to remember that part of them, I think there's such a power in that. And they want to give back to their new community as well. And that is also a way to do that. So that's the meaning behind that title.
It's an amazing story. And again, I was quite affected by that story, as some of your other stories. And what resonated here was also that he had the courage to play for others. So, knowing that he would risk his life, but I would imagine where he was, there were other people that could hear it, perhaps, even though it was quite quiet.
Well, I mean, during those times, you couldn't risk it. I mean, his family, but you couldn't. I mean, there was no hearing it. I mean, this is why it's interesting with my students. One other thing that I work on with them, because most of them do want to be concert guitarists, and as a concert guitarist, you have to work with sound to really project. And this is a big part of what I do with the students. How can we fill a concert hall with sound without amplification? And so when he first started playing for me, he played beautifully, but very, very, very quietly. And at first I thought, well, let's just work on making your sound bigger so you can perform. But when I understood why it was so quiet, then that was a very profound moment. So now afterwards, after the danger had lessened, yes, that's the time for community. But when you are you realize that if anyone hears you, you could be publicly executed or have your hands amputated, then you can't risk it. So that's the moment to go within and find your strength within. Much as the Afghan conductor was telling her colleagues, now is not the time to be heard. Now's the time basically to stay alive. But during that time of dormancy, their roots are growing very strongly. These girls are underground right now. My students are underground at the moment, but they were strengthening. Their roots were growing so that when the time came to bring this into the world, they're flourishing, they're strong, they're grounded.
Mm-hmm. And I do have one final question, but I was wondering if, did you want to have an opportunity to share one of your videos?
Oh gosh, yes, thank you so much for reminding me. Yes, so I can go on and on about what artists have told me about the importance of music to them. But actually, why not hear it in their own words? The faces of most of the artists you don't see, because when we made it in 2016, everybody was still in Syria and there was a tremendous risk. And so this is one artist who has given his blessing to be shown. And this is a piece that Rabi actually composed himself and recorded for us here in Lebanon during the 2 weeks that he was able to go and be safe during our academy.
We need the music because it's everything we have. Our life is terrible without music.
you cannot do anything about it. You cannot stop living your life, but at the same time you are always in fear.
Music is life to us. It gives us freedom and peace. It's like having stairs. Music is one language for everyone. The music like food for everyone. All the people in the world sing.
We are so broken and so sad, and the music is such a hope for us.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that clip. I think we did have a little bit of a sound issue, but it was beautiful music and beautiful demonstration of its potential for expression and freedom and identity. So I wanted to ask you just one final thing before, if you wouldn't mind. Given our discussion today and the topic, what do you think is important about to know about music for health providers, settlement agencies, and other sectors that work with people that have experienced forced migration and resettling in the Canadian or American or different contexts? What would you, any suggestions or recommendations?
I mean, I would like to find a way to encourage all people in this situation to play an instrument, even if it's only tapping on a little box. It's absolutely vital, I think, to have some form of self-expression. Now, you can do it with art as well, and I think that's very, very profound. But I have a friend in Houston, actually. She works at a cancer center for little kids. And one of the programs she has is she has these children write a little poem or write some little song, and then she sets it to music and they record it. And for these little kids, it is so powerful. They don't have to know music. They don't have to be musicians, but it's very profound for them, and their voices are heard and they feel powerful. And so I think that, if you're singing, if you're dancing, if you're playing a tambourine, even if you're not a musician, I think that is a moment of power. So I'd like to share one other little quick story. I was at another RIF in a safe house in Lebanon, and came with the guys. Several of the members later became Orantes, and these kids had been very, very traumatized, either through war or sexual violence. And so we came into this room, and the kids are just huddled, totally silent, not making eye contact, deeply, deeply traumatized. And we got to talking and playing, and finally, at the end of it, they all were dancing, and they were all playing little instruments that we brought. And night and day, I mean, I'm no scientist, but it was music that did that. It wasn't talking about their feelings. I mean, that's important too, there can be a language issue, but it was just the simple joy of allowing sound to move through you. And so for refugees who are musicians, I think absolutely they must be encouraged to play their music for the community, for their own community, for the wider community. They need to be empowered in any way possible. And for those who aren't, hearing music of their homelands is a big deal, but also just little beginner programs. One of the programs that we started in Beirut is once the guys, Orantes, had managed to get out of Syria to Beirut, you know, it's not so easy. It's not just that everything's fine now. So we started a program where they actually gave classes to refugee children. So we got the instruments and they would go into the camps, and it was interesting seeing both sides of it. For the kids, it was a really big deal to learn this new thing and get to make noise and yay. And for the guys who were refugees as well, the older people, they were able to give back. They were able to do what they knew that grounded them. And so I think Canada would be no different. The US would be no, well, mostly would be no different. So I think that's really important.
That's wonderful, Susan, and we really, you know, appreciate you sharing your lived experience and all your knowledge, especially now. It's just so important and inspiring. And I'd like to thank you again and thank everyone for their participation. And just in closing, to note that Canada will continue to increase its targets for immigration over the next few decades, as does the US. And arts-based approaches such as music can offer a lens into the stories and experience which can be used for promoting integration, health, and well-being. For those individuals and families who arrive in forced migrations contexts seeking belonging and safety and connection. So with a great thank you to you and everyone, we invite you to discuss how we might integrate music with our communities of practice, which receive people with lived experience of forced migration. So thank you, everybody. And Susan, I don't know
Nancy,
if you have any. Go ahead.
I just want to echo your comments, Nancy. Thank you, and also extend our thanks to you as well. Nancy, too, thank you for such a moving webinar. This has just been incredible, and can't thank you enough for sharing the videos, your lived experiences, and your work. You just described so well the role that music plays and the meaning it has. And it was really great to learn that today. We did have a few questions from the audience. So what we'll do is we want to keep this dialogue going. So we're actually going to move those to N4's online discussion forum called The Meeting Place. And Nancy and Susan have both offered to answer your questions there. So we will notify you when those have been answered, but make sure that you sign up to become a member of N4 so you can be a part of that dialogue and see their responses. And I'll just turn it to you, Susan, Nancy. Do you have any final words for our audience before we wrap up?
Well, I would like to say something, and that is, you know, the States, as you all know, hasn't been at its best low these last several years. And with the pandemic, you know, globally, I think that we're all rather traumatized. I mean, we're not necessarily in a war zone, but we've gone through a lot. And so the things that I would say for refugees, I think are important for all of us, you know, to have that thing that grounds you, that's outside the media, that's outside of the fighting and the chaos, and that reminds you of beauty. You know, in Texas, things are certainly quite divided here. And talking about it at some point, you know, for someone like me, who's an artist, you know, talking about it's not going to do a lot. Playing and helping people to calm down and remember what they love and who they are, I think is really the solution. I think that's our greatest hope.
What a beautiful message. Thank you. Thank you both again so much. And thanks to everyone who tuned in today. We hope to see you at a future N4 event and also engaging in the dialogue in N4's Meeting Place. And stay safe, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you, Mariah, Andrew, and Nancy. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thanks, Susan, for sharing your knowledge and experience. Thank you. Thanks, Mariah and Andrew, and thanks for everyone participating.
Thank you.